The cabin wasn't much, just a small weathered box sitting on a rise in the middle of thick Tennessee woods. We found it online for cheap 3 nights for friends and not much else. It had power, running water, 2 bedrooms, a busted but working fireplace, and a porch that sagged like an old man's back. None of us cared. We were looking for quiet, a place to drink, laugh, and get off our phones for a while. We were all 20-something, tired of jobs and cities and always being connected. The first night passed like any camping trip. We grilled burgers, drank beer, played cards, told dumb stories. The wind rustled through the trees and the nearest house was miles away. No cell signal, which we actually liked. The only way we could call out was over the landline phone in the kitchen, one of those yellowed push-button ones from the 90s. We joked about it being a murder cabin, half expecting a bear to show up or something, but really, it just felt old and quiet. The only thing that felt off was the smell under the porch. Wet wood and something musty, but that didn't seem weird for a place like this. Second night, just after dinner, I dropped my flashlight through the gaps in the porch boards. It was one of those rubber ones with a heavy battery pack that clattered like hell when it hit the ground. I crouched down, tried to reach for it, but my fingers couldn't grab it. So I went around the side and ducked under the porch. It was cramped. Cobwebs brushed my arms and I could feel dirt sticking to my palms. The flashlight beam danced over dead leaves and empty bottles someone must have left years ago. And that's when I saw the glow. It was soft and bluish, just a few feet away, tucked against the wall of the cabin. A phone. I froze. It was turned on. The screen was lit and the camera app was open. There was no lock screen, just the camera view. My flashlight reflected off the glass. I grabbed it without thinking, half expecting it to be a dead, useless shell, but it was warm in my hand. I backed out and showed the guys. We sat on the living room floor and went through it. The phone wasn't password protected. Nothing fancy about it. Old Android, cracked screen, 27% battery left. The gallery opened right up. The photos were recent, all of them. The first few were random shots of the woods, the porch, some blurry night shots. But then they changed. There were pictures of us. Not taken from inside, not ones we'd taken ourselves. They were taken from outside the cabin, through the windows. Most of them were close-ups of our faces, zoomed in or from low angles. The kind of angles you'd get if you were crawling or crouched. One of me laughing with a beer in my hand. One of Caleb grilling. One of Jake brushing his teeth in the window. All taken without us knowing. All from under the porch or outside the windows. Then we found the last one. It was a 10-second video. We played it. The sound was muffled, but you could hear us talking, laughing, silverware clinking on plates. The video was shot through the living room window. You could see the 4 of us sitting at the table eating dinner. None of us had seen or heard anyone. We locked the doors. All of them. There weren't many, just the front and back, and a window in the bathroom that didn't quite shut all the way. We dragged a table in front of the back door and kept the fireplace poker close. We turned off all the lights inside and lit a few candles. Every time one of us got up to use the bathroom or grab something from the kitchen, the rest would flinch. We felt like rats inside a glass cage, being watched. We took shifts. Jake and Caleb stayed up first while I tried to sleep on the couch. Couldn't. My stomach wouldn't calm down, and every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone crouched just outside the window, face pressed against the glass. I finally drifted off a little after midnight. Caleb woke me up at around 1. He whispered, "There's someone out back." That sentence hit me like a slap. I sat up slowly, heart already hammering. The cabin was dead quiet, except for the crackling of the dying fire. I followed Caleb to the back window and he pointed. There was a figure standing at the treeline. Not moving, just standing there. Not close, but close enough to see the outline. Could have been a man. Could have been wearing a hood. Couldn't tell. The trees behind him were thick, and the moonlight wasn't strong enough to make out much. We stared for what felt like 10 minutes. It never moved. It just watched. Caleb whispered, "I'm going out there." I told him not to, but he already had the poker in his hand and was walking to the door before I could stop him. He didn't run, but he moved fast. I followed him out. The cold slapped me across the face. We both charged toward the spot, yelling, but there was nothing. When we reached the treeline, it was empty. The ground was covered in dry leaves and pine needles, and there wasn't a single footprint. Not even broken branches, just silence. We turned our flashlights in every direction, calling out, but no one answered. We stood out there for another 10 minutes, swinging the beams in circles, before we finally gave up and went back in. No one slept after that. We sat around the cold fireplace, bags under our eyes, checking the windows every few minutes. We waited for the sun. When the sky finally turned pink, we grabbed everything: bags, clothes, coolers, gear, and threw it in the back of Jake's SUV. We didn't even clean up. We didn't care about getting the deposit back. We just wanted to get off that mountain. The drive down was long and quiet. The tires crunched over gravel and dirt until we hit the main road. It was only then that we started to breathe normally again. The trees got less dense. The sky opened up. We didn't talk much, just kept glancing at the rearview mirror. About 20 minutes down, my phone buzzed. Somehow I had a signal again. One new message. It was from a number I didn't recognize. No name, just 10 digits. I opened it. The message said, "Asterisk, you left too soon. I wasn't done yet. Asterisk." My skin went cold. I showed the others. We checked the phone we found, same number. That was the last straw. We pulled over and smashed the phone on a rock until the screen was just glass dust. We tossed the remains into a creek we passed and drove without stopping until we hit the nearest town. We never went back. We never called the cabin's owner. We never reported it. None of us wanted our names attached to anything like that. We talked about it once, maybe twice after that trip, but mostly we just let it die. But sometimes, late at night, I still wonder how long they were watching us, and if they were already under the porch before we even arrived. My girlfriend and I rented a cabin up in Colorado that February. She had found it online, one of those quiet, snowy spots that look like they're pulled straight out of a postcard. It was just the two of us, tucked away deep in the woods, surrounded by nothing but pine trees and hills blanketed in snow. We both wanted a break from people and noise and everything else that came with city life. No cell service, no neighbors, no roads for miles. It was exactly what we were looking for. The first 2 days were perfect. We got in just before sunset on a Friday, the sun going down behind the trees as we parked the car on a small plowed path that led to the cabin. Inside, the place was simple but cozy. Wooden floors, old couches, a fireplace with stacked logs beside it. There were books on a shelf, a coffee maker that took forever to brew anything, and a tiny radio that barely picked up a signal. Everything creaked when you walked, and there was only one bedroom, but it felt like enough. We spent those first 2 days doing nothing much. Drinking hot chocolate, playing cards, cooking simple meals on the tiny stovetop, and reading. The snow kept falling in soft waves outside. There were big windows that looked out at the forest, and we'd sit there for hours watching the trees sway. At night, the whole world outside turned black, like someone had painted over it. Not even moonlight got through the clouds. All you could hear was the wind pushing against the cabin. That third morning, I got up early. She was still asleep. I was just planning to step outside, stretch my legs, get a breath of cold air. I opened the front door and walked onto the porch. The snow had fallen overnight. Not heavy, just a thin, fresh layer, maybe an inch or two thick. That's when I saw the footprints. They were clear as day. A single set of tracks leading from the woods. The tree line started maybe 50 feet from the back of the cabin and heading straight toward the cabin's back window. Then they turned around and went back the same way. Except the window they went to was our bedroom. And I was sure, absolutely sure, they hadn't been there the night before. We'd both stepped outside before bed. I smoked a cigarette out front. There was nothing in the snow then. That light layer had to have fallen after we went to sleep, which meant someone had walked up to our cabin in the middle of the night. Recently, I walked around back, following the prints. They were narrow, longer than mine, and spaced out like someone had been walking slowly. Not running, not stumbling, just calm, slow steps. They stopped at the window, and I could see faint smudges on the glass, like the greasy outline of a forehead and a nose pressed against it. No cracks, no fingerprints, just vague face-shaped smears. I didn't wake her. I didn't want to scare her, but something about it put a weight in my chest I couldn't shake. I spent most of the day just sitting inside, staring out the windows. We kept the fire going, ate lunch in silence. I didn't mention the footprints, not then. She seemed so relaxed, and I didn't want to ruin it unless I had to. That night, I made sure both locks on the door were turned. I pushed one of the chairs under the front knob too, just for extra peace of mind. I even checked all the windows, pulled every curtain shut, and left the lights off after dinner. The dark felt heavy, like it was pressing in from all sides. She fell asleep easily, curled up under the thick comforter. I stayed up, just listening. For a long time, there was nothing but the soft cracking of the fire as it burned down to embers. Then, sometime after 3 a.m., I heard it. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Footsteps, slow, steady, in the snow. They weren't coming from the front. I knew the sound of that path. These were coming from the side, near the back wall. The side where the bedroom was. I didn't move. I just lay there, eyes open in the dark, barely breathing. The steps kept coming one after the other. Then they stopped, right outside the wall behind our bed, close enough that I could feel it. Whoever it was had walked right up to the cabin again and just stopped. I waited. Minutes passed. No more sounds. No walking away. No crunch of steps fading into the woods. Nothing. Just silence. At some point, I must have dozed off, because when I opened my eyes again, it was morning. The fire was completely out, and she was still asleep beside me. I got up quietly, put on my boots and jacket, and stepped outside. The snow was fresh again. Not much had fallen, just a thin dusting over everything. But it was enough to show new tracks. They came from the tree line again, the same direction. They walked right up to the cabin, to the exact same spot as the night before. But there were no tracks leading away. The footprints just ended at the wall. No turnaround, no retreat, nothing. I walked a few feet back and forth, trying to see if maybe the wind had covered the return path. But there was no sign of anything, not even a partial print. Just a single trail coming up from the trees to the bedroom wall. And then, nothing. I stood there for a long time just staring at them. They were barefoot. Whoever had come to the cabin in the middle of the night had walked through the snow without shoes. Their prints were detailed enough that I could see the individual toes, the arch of the foot. The skin must have been freezing. It didn't make sense. When she woke up, I finally told her everything. About the prints the morning before, the smudges on the glass, the sounds I heard at night. She didn't laugh. She didn't brush it off. She just looked at me and said we should leave. We packed in under 10 minutes. No breakfast. We didn't even bother cleaning up. Just threw everything into the bags, shut off the gas heater, and left. We didn't talk much on the drive back. I kept looking in the rearview mirror like I expected someone to be standing in the road behind us. Nothing ever appeared, but I couldn't shake the feeling. A few days later, back home, I went through the photos I'd taken. Most of them were just normal shots of the trees, the porch, her reading by the fire. But I had snapped pictures of the prints, too. Several angles. I still have them saved. Every time I look at them, I feel that same pit in my stomach. The shape of the foot. The way the toes curl slightly into the snow. You can tell they weren't running. They weren't stumbling. Whoever it was walked slowly, calmly, and left no trace of leaving. I've looked into missing persons in the area, checked forums, tried to find explanations, but nothing fits. No shelters nearby, no drifters reported, no hikers lost that week. And who the hell walks barefoot through snow-covered woods in the middle of the night? I haven't gone back to the woods since. Neither has she. We don't talk about it anymore, but the photos are still there, buried in a folder on my hard drive. I don't open them often, but when I do, I always find myself staring at the prints for way too long. Every time, they look more human than I want them to. And every time I remind myself, Whoever made them stood outside our bedroom wall and never walked away. I rented a remote cabin in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan in early October, about a month after a really messy breakup. I'd been with her for 4 years, and when it ended, it felt like my whole life had been stripped away overnight. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I didn't want to go out drinking or crash on a friend's couch or pretend I was okay. I wanted to get as far away from people as I could. Just trees, cold air, silence. I found the cabin on a website that catered to long-term rentals. The ad said, perfect for solitude and deep woods, no nearby neighbors. And I was sold. I booked it for 2 weeks and packed everything I thought I'd need. Frozen meals, firewood, some books, a couple knives, a small hatchet, and my old hiking boots. The drive up took the better part of a day. Once I got off the main highways, it was nothing but winding gravel roads through forests that seemed to stretch forever. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, it was early evening and getting cold. The place was tucked into the trees. No other houses or cabins in sight, just woods on all sides. It was old, maybe from the 50s, but well maintained. The outside was wood planked, painted a kind of faded brown red, and there was a little porch with a single chair and a pair of empty flower pots. The key was under a stone frog next to the steps, just like the owner had said. Inside, the cabin was small but cozy. There was a main room with a wood stove, a couch, a kitchenette with an old gas stove, and a tiny table with 2 chairs. The bedroom was at the end of the hallway, past a small bathroom with a tub and a rusty mirror. The place smelled like cedar and something faintly sweet, like old pipe tobacco. But there was one thing that stuck out immediately: the last door on the left at the end of the hallway. It was painted the same as the others, but the lock on it was different. It was newer, much newer, an industrial silver deadbolt with a keyhole, not one of the older brass doorknobs like the others. It was locked tight, no key in sight. I figured it was a utility closet or the owner's private storage. Still, something about it felt wrong. It didn't match the rest of the cabin. The first night was uneventful. I made some pasta, poured a drink, and read until I was too tired to keep my eyes open. The woods were so quiet I could hear my own breathing. The second night is when things started to feel off. Around midnight, I was still awake, scrolling through my phone when I heard something. It was faint, coming from the hallway. At first I thought maybe it was the wind pushing against the house. But then I heard it again. Slow, steady, rhythmic, breathing, not my own. Not an animal's chittering or scratching. Actual breathing. Deep, steady inhales and exhales coming from behind that locked door. I held my breath, listening. My heart was pounding so loud I could barely hear anything else. I didn't get up. I stayed completely still in bed and told myself it was the wind in the trees or maybe some kind of animal in the walls. Raccoons or squirrels. The forest was full of them. I eventually fell asleep, probably from sheer exhaustion. The next morning I walked down the hallway and saw something that made my stomach tighten. There were faint marks on the hardwood floor just outside that locked door. Light scuff marks, like the kind left by shoes when someone walks in place or shifts back and forth a lot. I knelt down and looked closer. They weren't scratches from claws or paws. They were from soles, human shoes. It looked like someone had been standing there, pacing or maybe rocking from heel to toe. The wood was worn in a soft oval pattern. I tried to stay rational. Maybe the owner came by before I arrived. Maybe someone had been cleaning and just wore down the wood from standing there. Maybe it was all old damage and I just hadn't noticed it right away. But it didn't feel old. I would have seen it the first day. I went outside and walked around the cabin, checking every window and the front door. All locked. No signs of anything unusual. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. That day, I took a short hike just to clear my head. The trees were beautiful, turning red and gold and shedding leaves that made a soft crunch under my boots. I found a river about a mile away and sat on a log for a while, trying to remind myself why I'd come. The peace, the quiet, the freedom, but the feeling I had when I looked back at that cabin never left me. That night, I decided to keep a knife on the nightstand. It was just a 4-inch blade I used for cooking or camping. Nothing fancy, but sharp. I turned in around 10 p.m., tired but wired, my ears tuned to every noise. I think I must have dozed off around midnight. Then I heard it, a soft click. It was so quiet it could have been nothing, but I knew it was that lock, that door. I sat up fast, grabbed the knife, and crept out of bed barefoot. The hallway was completely dark, but I didn't want to turn on the lights. I moved slow, staying quiet. When I got halfway down the hall, I saw it. The door at the end was open, just a crack, maybe 2 inches, enough to see the edge of something gray behind it. I raised the knife and used the blade tip to push the door open. The room was maybe 6 by 6 feet, bare concrete walls, no windows. In the middle of the room was a wooden chair, scratched up and stained. Against the back wall was a pile of things: an old sleeping bag, water bottles, empty chip bags, a half-used roll of toilet paper. Someone had been living in there. The smell hit me a second later: sweat, rot, old plastic, piss. I backed out of the room immediately, shut the door, and locked it with the bolt still hanging from the inside knob. I didn't bother packing. I grabbed my wallet, keys, phone, threw my boots on without tying them, and ran to the car. I started it so fast I peeled out and sprayed gravel behind me. I drove an hour before I found a gas station that was open. The kid at the counter gave me a weird look, but I didn't care. I used their phone to call the sheriff's office. 2 deputies met me and followed me back to the cabin just after sunrise. I didn't go inside. I waited in the car while they cleared the place. When they came out, they confirmed it. Someone had been living in that locked room. There were signs they'd been there for a while. No signs of forced entry, no broken windows or doors, which meant whoever it was had a key. When they questioned the owner, he claimed he didn't know anything about it. Said he thought maybe his nephew was using the cabin sometimes. Said he didn't check it too often. But when they looked deeper into it, the guy didn't have a nephew. No family nearby at all. The lock had been added months earlier, according to receipts they found in his email. No record of any extra keys being given out. They never caught the guy. Whoever had been staying there left without a trace. No prints, no ID, nothing. Just his trash and that awful smell. I didn't go back. I left everything I'd brought behind: my clothes, gear, books. I didn't care. I was just glad I was alive and unharmed. Sometimes at night I still think about that locked door, about the breathing. How long had he been there? Watching, listening? Had he ever come out while I slept? I don't go into the woods alone anymore. Not because of bears or bad weather, but because sometimes the scariest thing out there isn't the dark or the isolation. It's the person already waiting inside. When I was a kid, my dad and I went fishing every summer. Same spot every time. A set of campgrounds about a 4-hour drive from where we lived. It was mostly tents and RVs, but there were 6 old cabins there too, lined up in a row off a dirt road, not far from the lake. We always stayed in cabin 3 or 4. My dad liked cabin 4 best because it was close enough to the lake trail, but far enough from the communal fire pit and showers that you didn't hear people too much at night. After he died, I didn't go back for a couple years. Just didn't feel right without him. When I was 19, I finally decided to go again. Alone this time. I told myself it was about fishing, maybe thinking back on some memories, but honestly I think I just wanted to see if it felt the same. I booked cabin 4. Nothing fancy, just an old wooden structure with a rusty stove, a thin mattress on a creaky bed frame, a bare light bulb on the ceiling, and a toilet with a curtain instead of a door. The smell inside was always the same: damp wood and something like old matches. Familiar and a little sad. The cabins were numbered 1 through 6. Cabin 6 was 2 doors down from mine, right at the end of the line, past the overgrown trail to the river. I remembered it from when I was younger because it had been boarded up even back then. My dad had said there was a fire in there once and no one had stayed in it since. He didn't talk about it much and I never really asked. The windows were covered with thick plywood. The door chained shut with a rusted lock. Every year it looked more abandoned. The first 2 nights were quiet. I fished during the day, read a little, cooked on the stove when the fire pit was too much trouble. There were only 2 other cabins occupied that week, both on the other end, near cabin 1. I barely saw the people, just caught glimpses of them walking down toward the lake in the mornings. The nights were what I came for, dead silent except for the wind in the trees and the occasional creak of a squirrel on the roof or something scurrying through the bushes. On my second night, I got up to use the toilet around 1 in the morning. It was cold. I remember standing there, half asleep, staring at the wood grain on the cabin wall when something caught my eye, a soft light. I turned and looked through the side window, the one that faced down the line toward cabin 6. There was a light in the window. At first, I thought it might have been a reflection or something. I blinked and leaned closer. No mistake. It was faint, but it was definitely there. A soft yellow glow shining behind one of the plywood boards that didn't quite sit flush against the frame. I stood there staring for at least 30 seconds, not breathing much, just trying to figure it out. There was no power in that cabin, and it had been sealed for years. The next morning, I walked to the main office near the trailhead. The groundskeeper was a guy in his 50s with a gut and a permanent frown. I asked him, real casual, if anyone was staying in cabin 6. He looked up from the paper he was reading and shook his head. "That one's been empty a long time," he said. "No power in there either." "Why?" I told him I thought I saw a light, but he just shrugged. "Probably the moon. Nothing in there but ash and broken glass." I nodded and left, but something about the way he said it, too quick, too final, put me off. That night I didn't sleep much. I kept looking out the window every 20 minutes or so, but cabin 6 stayed dark, completely black. Then came the third night. I was lying in bed, just staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind. It was cold again, and I had wrapped my sleeping bag around myself, trying to stay warm. I remember glancing at the stove and thinking I should have lit a fire earlier. Then I heard it. 3 slow knocks, not on the door, on the wall, the back wall, the one that faced cabin 6. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't loud, more like someone tapping slowly with their knuckles or maybe a stick. I didn't move at first. My heart felt like it had just dropped into my stomach. I sat there, frozen, staring at the wall. After maybe 30 seconds, I pulled the covers off and stood up. My legs were stiff and my mouth felt dry. I walked slowly to the window and pushed one of the slats on the blinds just enough to peek through. A figure stood between the cabins. Not moving, not swaying, just standing there. Couldn't see a face. It looked like a man, tall, broad shoulders, maybe wearing a jacket. He was about 20 feet away, standing on the narrow strip of dirt that ran behind the cabins, right outside the window. I stared for a while, then finally shouted, "Hey!" The figure turned. I didn't hear footsteps, but it walked slowly back toward cabin 6. Not in a hurry, just turned and went. It disappeared into the shadows near the boarded-up front door. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in the chair near the stove with my pocket knife in my hand and a flashlight on the table. I kept looking at the wall where the knocks came from. I kept thinking about how the figure didn't run, like it wasn't surprised, like it knew I'd be watching. The sun came up around 5. I waited until 7 to step outside. The air was cold and smelled like wet pine. I walked slowly around the side of my cabin toward the back wall. The dirt between cabin 4 and cabin 6 was hard-packed but had some pine needles and leaves scattered over it. No clear footprints. Then I saw it. Something stuck to the wall right below the window. A photo, black and white, curled at the edges from moisture. It was stuck there with a nail. An old, bent nail like the kind you'd find in a barn wall. I pulled it off and looked closer. It was a picture of me, sleeping. The angle was from inside the cabin. I could see the bed, the corner of the stove, even my backpack lying on the floor. I was curled in the sleeping bag, facing the wall, mouth slightly open. It wasn't a copy of an old photo or anything. It was recent. My hair was the same. I had a bandage on my thumb from when I'd cut myself gutting a trout the day before. It was me, from this trip. I checked the cabin from top to bottom, every inch, under the bed, inside the stove, behind the curtain near the toilet. There weren't many places to hide, but I checked anyway. The windows were locked from the inside. The door too. There were no signs of anyone coming in or out. I packed up and left before noon. I didn't stop to tell the groundskeeper. I didn't even take the food out of the stove. I drove straight home, checking my mirrors every few minutes like I expected someone to be following me. That was 2 years ago. I haven't been back since. Sometimes I wake up at night thinking I heard those 3 knocks again. Sometimes I dream about the photo. I still have it. I keep it in a drawer at the bottom of my desk. I don't show it to anyone. I don't want to explain it. I don't even want to look at it again. But I haven't thrown it away. I just want to know who took it and how they got inside. I stayed at my uncle's cabin in the summer of 2016. It was in the middle of nowhere, somewhere in northern Pennsylvania. I hadn't been up there since I was a kid, but I remembered it being peaceful, quiet, surrounded by forest on all sides, the closest neighbor probably a mile or 2 away. After a rough semester at school and a bad breakup, I needed some time alone. When I got the email from my uncle saying the cabin was available and I could use it for a week, it felt like perfect timing. He sent me an address, a short note with some basic instructions, and said he'd leave the key under the fake rock near the porch steps. I didn't question it. When I got there, the place looked exactly how I remembered. Plain wooden exterior, chipped paint on the porch railings, a rusted wind chime hanging above the door. I walked in, and it smelled like old wood, like a mix of pine and dust. The furniture was still the same. Old green plaid couch, a wood stove in the corner, a little kitchen with a tiny fridge and stove that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s. There was no cell service, no internet. That was part of the appeal, though. I just wanted to read, hike, and sleep in late. There was a narrow hallway with 3 doors, a bathroom, a bedroom, and a door at the very end that had always been locked. As a kid, I remember asking my uncle what was behind that door, and he always said it was just storage. I didn't think about it much then. On the first day, I didn't even check it. I just settled in, unpacked my stuff, made a sandwich, and spent the afternoon sitting out on the porch with a book, listening to the wind through the trees. It was the second morning when things started to feel off. I woke up and found the basement door slightly open. At first, I thought I was imagining it. I stood in the hallway for a few seconds, staring at the door like it might shut on its own. It was one of those thin, hollow wood doors with a simple brass knob. I walked over and opened it slowly, creaked, loud and sharp. There was a narrow staircase leading down, unlit, with the smell of cold concrete and mildew coming up from below. I flipped a light switch just inside the door and a single bulb at the bottom came on, casting a weak yellow glow. I stood at the top of the stairs for a long time. I wasn't scared exactly. I was just curious, maybe a little hesitant. But eventually, I started down the stairs. They were steep, creaky, and the air got colder with each step. When I reached the bottom, I saw what looked like an old workshop. Dust covered everything: tools, shelves, cardboard boxes, some fishing gear, old paint cans. Cobwebs in the corners, a rolled-up tent leaning against the wall. Nothing strange. Nothing worth locking up for decades. Then I noticed a small metal shelf against the far wall. It had a few VHS tapes lined up in a neat row, each one labeled in black marker with a date. The oldest was from the early 90s. The most recent said June 10th, 2016. That was just 2 weeks before I arrived. That's when something started to feel wrong. I took a few tapes upstairs. There was a VCR hooked up to the little old TV in the living room. I sat down, popped in the first tape, and hit play. The footage was grainy and green-tinted, probably filmed in night vision. It showed a man sleeping on the couch, the same couch I'd been sitting on. The camera was still, positioned in the corner of the room. The man in the footage turned a few times but didn't wake up. I fast-forwarded. Nothing happened. Hours of someone just sleeping creeped me out more than I expected. I tried another tape. Same setup. This time a woman was asleep in the bedroom. The camera must have been placed in the corner of the room, angled at the bed. She moved a little during the night, but again, nothing else. No sound, no motion from whoever was recording. Just silent footage, always filmed from some hidden spot inside the cabin. I watched 3 more. Different people each time, sometimes a couple, sometimes alone. Always at night, always sleeping. No explanations, no context. I felt like I shouldn't be watching them, like I was part of something I didn't understand. My skin crawled, but I had to check the last one. The one from just 2 weeks ago. I put it in and hit play. The angle was different this time. It was the bedroom again, the same room I had been sleeping in the night before. My heart started beating faster. At first, it was just the empty room, dimly lit by moonlight through the window. Then, after a minute or so, I saw myself walk into the room. I was in my pajamas. I crawled into bed and pulled the blanket over me. I was asleep within minutes. The camera didn't move, didn't zoom, but someone had to have set it up. Someone had to have come into the cabin before I got there. Or worse, while I was already there. I stopped the tape, just yanked it out and dropped it on the floor. I sat there for a long time, my hands shaking, heart racing. I tried to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe my uncle had filmed guests. Maybe he had security cameras and just recorded everyone for some reason. But that last tape was of me, and I hadn't even known there was a camera. I grabbed my backpack and started throwing everything inside. I didn't even shut the drawers or fold anything. I was out of the cabin in under 10 minutes. I got in my car and drove down the mountain road until I hit a gas station with a working payphone. I called the police from there. When I explained what I found, they took it seriously. A few officers met me back at the cabin later that day. I showed them the tapes, the basement, everything. They took the recordings and launched an investigation. A week later, I got a call from the detective handling the case. He asked me where I got the keys to the cabin. I told him my uncle had sent me an email and told me they'd be under a fake rock by the steps. He went quiet for a second and then said, "Your uncle's been dead for over 2 years. He passed in 2014. That didn't make sense. I got the email a month ago, but when they traced the email address, it didn't match anything from my uncle's records. They said someone had created it just months earlier. Whoever gave me the keys, whoever I thought was my uncle, wasn't him. Just someone pretending to be. Someone who'd been living in that cabin, or at least using it, and filming people while they slept. The police never found the guy. There were no fingerprints in the cabin. No DNA. Whoever it was, they knew what they were doing. I haven't gone back since, and I never will. I still think about it sometimes. How long had he been doing it? How many people had he watched? Had he ever done more than just film? I'll never know. All I know is that I spent a night in that cabin, thinking I was alone, not knowing someone had been in the walls, behind the door, or even in the room, watching, recording, and I'll never feel fully safe again. I rented the cabin because I needed to be away from people. Work had been eating me alive for over a year, and when I finally snapped at someone in the office, I knew it was time. I found this place online. Some bare-bones listing with 3 grainy photos and a description that just said, "Secluded cabin, hillside, no neighbors, solar power, wood stove, bring supplies." It was way up in the northern woods, about 6 hours from where I lived. The road there turned to gravel, then dirt, then finally nothing at all but a rutted path barely wide enough for my car. I had to park off the trail and carry my stuff the last 100 yards. I didn't see another soul once I left the highway. The cabin sat on a steep slope, thick trees rising behind it and falling away in front. No lawn, no driveway, just forest. The ground was littered with dry pine needles and dead branches, and I had to watch my footing. The air was sharp with that clean, damp smell you get deep in the woods. The cabin was smaller than I thought it'd be. Just a single room with a wood stove in one corner, a small bed, and a table with 2 chairs. There was a pump out back for water and a composting toilet in a shed about 20 yards into the trees. No cell service, no Wi-Fi. That was the idea. I unpacked and set up my food, mostly canned stuff and dry goods. I'd brought a rifle, not for hunting, but because the guy who rented me the place mentioned bears. I wasn't worried, but it made me feel better. The first day passed quietly. I spent most of it walking around the area, trying to get a sense of the place. There wasn't much, just endless trees, rocks, the sound of birds and wind. I slept well that night with the stove going and the cool air coming in from the cracked window. The second day was when I started noticing small things. Nothing dramatic, just little things that made me pause, like how the trail I'd walked the day before had a branch across it that hadn't been there, or how the pump handle felt warmer than the air around it, like it had been used recently. I told myself it was animals or maybe just my nerves. I'd been so wired before the trip that it made sense I'd need time to adjust. I spent that day chopping some kindling, stacking wood, and trying to read. The silence got to me after a while. It wasn't like the kind of quiet in a house. It was deep. No hum from appliances. No cars in the distance. Just wind and the occasional creak of the trees. That night, I kept the rifle closer to the bed. I felt stupid for doing it, but I did it anyway. On the third morning, I found something behind the outhouse. It was early, barely light, and I'd stepped out to use the toilet. The pine needles were slick with dew, and everything looked gray and damp. As I walked back to the cabin, I noticed marks in the dirt. Footprints, but not boots or shoes, bare feet. Human, not animal. The prints were smudged and shallow, but they were definitely made by someone barefoot, and they led around the back of the cabin and into the trees. I stood there a long time. I wasn't even breathing. Then I turned slowly and followed the prints a little way into the woods, just far enough to see where they disappeared into the underbrush. No trail, no sign of anyone living nearby. Just empty woods. I backed away and went inside. Locked the door, even though I knew that wouldn't stop anyone determined. The rifle stayed next to me all day. I didn't go back outside except to piss just off the porch. That night was worse. I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to make it obvious someone was inside. I lay in bed with my boots on, listening. At one point, maybe around 2 in the morning, I thought I heard movement outside. Not animals, too steady, like footsteps, crunching slowly through the needles. I stayed dead still, barely even blinking. It stopped eventually. I never looked out the window. I didn't want to know. When the sun came up, I packed. I didn't eat. I didn't clean up. I just shoved everything into bags and grabbed the rifle. I took one last look at the edge of the trees before I started hiking back to the car. I kept checking over my shoulder the whole time. Nothing, just forest. I got to the car and found it unlocked. I always locked it, even out there. Nothing was missing, but the driver's seat was pushed back a few inches, like someone taller than me had sat there. That detail sat in my chest like a brick. I started the engine and drove. Didn't stop until I hit pavement again. I didn't call the cops. I didn't tell the guy who rented the cabin. I didn't tell anyone for a long time. What was I going to say? That I saw some footprints? That I heard something walking at night? It all sounds weak when you say it out loud, but I know what I felt. That place wasn't empty. Weeks passed before I felt normal again. I kept checking the locks in my apartment, kept glancing out the window at night. I'd dream about the woods sometimes, but not like nightmares. Just cold, quiet dreams where I couldn't move and something was always just out of view. A few months later, I got curious. I looked up the area online again, tried to find other listings or reviews of the cabin. I couldn't find the original listing. The site it had been on didn't have anything close. I checked satellite maps and thought I found the clearing, but it didn't show any sign of a building, just trees. I even drove back toward the area once, thinking I might go find it again in daylight, just to prove to myself that it was still there. But I couldn't even find the trail. Everything looked different, like it had grown over, or maybe I'd imagined the whole place. But I didn't. I remember how the floor creaked when I stepped near the stove. I remember how the sunlight came through the one window in the late afternoon. I remember the bare footprints behind the outhouse, the ones that led into the woods and didn't come back out. I still have the rifle. I keep it in the closet. I haven't gone camping since. I've thought about it, sure, but something always stops me. Sometimes I'll wake up at night and my heart's pounding, and I won't know why. I'll lie there listening, just like I did in that cabin, waiting for a sound that never comes. But the worst part is knowing that someone was out there. watching, walking barefoot through the woods in the middle of nowhere. They never tried to talk. They never showed themselves. They just wanted me to know they were there. And maybe that was the point. Not to hurt me, not to steal, just to remind me how alone I really was out there. How close they could get without me noticing. How little I could do to stop them if they wanted to. I think about that sometimes. How easy it was for them. How easy it still would be. Two years ago, I rented a cabin in the mountains of Oregon so I could finish my dissertation. It was buried deep in the forest, maybe an hour's drive from the nearest gas station and small store. I'd found it listed through a university bulletin board. Some professor's family owned it and barely used it. It was perfect for what I needed. Isolation. No internet, no phone signal, no distractions. Just a small cabin with 2 floors, a fireplace, a kitchen with a gas stove, a few windows, and a little attic that I never really needed to go into. It was early spring, still cold in the evenings, and the nights felt long. The road up to the cabin was steep and full of switchbacks. I had to park at a clearing and hike the last 20 minutes with my gear on foot. The first week passed quietly. I'd get up around 7, drink instant coffee, and start typing until I couldn't stare at the screen anymore. The silence out there was thick. No hum of appliances, no cars. Just whined through the trees and the occasional bird. I slept early. Read in the evenings by lantern light. The kind of place where you can hear your own heartbeat if you sit still long enough. I didn't see another person for that entire week. I liked that, or I thought I did. On the 7th night, just past 1 in the morning, I woke up to a noise. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp and specific. A scrape, like something dragging lightly across the outside wall. The cabin's bedroom was on the first floor, and the head of the bed was up against the outer wall that faced the forest. I lay still, listening. Nothing. I figured it might have been a branch, moved by the wind, though it hadn't been windy earlier. I turned on my flashlight and sat up. The room looked normal. My boots were by the door. The backpack I'd brought was leaning against the wall, half unzipped. I stepped outside. Cold air hit me in the face. I aimed the flashlight around the perimeter of the cabin. The beam cut through the trees and caught a few glints off the dew-covered grass, but nothing out of place. I stood there for a few minutes, listening. The trees swayed, but the air was still. I went back inside and locked the door. I didn't sleep right away. I lay on my back, eyes open, flashlight still in my hand. About 10 minutes passed, and just as I was starting to drift again, I heard it. Another scrape. This time it came from above. It was fainter but higher up. I knew the sound of nails on wood. And this wasn't an animal. It moved with intent, slow, long drags, like someone deliberately scratching a plank with their fingernails. It slid from one side of the ceiling to the other, then stopped. My heart was pounding. I sat up again, barely breathing. Then I heard a dull thud. On the roof. Not loud. Like something or someone had landed lightly or was shifting their weight. I stood frozen for a moment. Then I turned off my flashlight and walked slowly to the window, trying not to step on the creaky parts of the floor. I pulled back the curtain and looked out. The yard was empty. Trees surrounded the cabin on all sides, their trunks black against the faint silver light. I could just barely see the roofline from that angle, maybe the lower edge of it above the window frame, but not the top. I stood there, watching, listening, and then, unmistakably, I heard breathing. Not mine. A slow, steady exhale. It was above me. I turned and stared at the ceiling. The roof was steep, almost triangular. The attic was small and sat right above the bedroom. There was a wooden hatch in the hallway ceiling that led to it. I'd noticed it the day I arrived, but hadn't paid much attention. Now I couldn't take my eyes off it. I stepped into the hall, flashlight back in my hand, and craned my neck up toward the hatch. It was a simple square with a pull string. I didn't pull it. Instead, I stepped up onto a chair and pressed my ear to the wood. The breathing got louder. Close. It wasn't hurried. It was steady, like someone sitting quietly in the dark. My skin crawled. I climbed down, grabbed my coat and flashlight, and opened the front door. I didn't think. I just moved. My boots weren't even fully laced. I stepped outside and walked backward, the flashlight beam jumping and shaking. I kept the light on the roofline, angling it as best I could through the trees. Then I saw him, a man, crouched on the peak of the roof, facing away from me. He wasn't moving. His back was hunched, knees drawn to his chest, arms wrapped around his shins, like some kind of statue or gargoyle, just sitting there, balanced perfectly at the roof's highest point. I stood there for maybe 10 seconds, not breathing. Then I shouted. He didn't react, not a twitch. I stood frozen. I didn't want to get closer, but I couldn't look away either. I kept my light trained on him, but it was too dark to make out his face, just the shape of his body and the outline of what looked like long, unkempt hair. He looked thin. After a few more seconds, I turned and walked fast down the trail, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly over rocks and dirt. I nearly fell twice. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I drove down that mountain in the dark, tires skidding on turns, not caring. I made it to town before sunrise and slept in the back seat in the parking lot of a diner. When the diner opened, I used their landline to call the police. I gave them directions to the cabin as best I could. A pair of deputies met me later that morning, and we drove up together. I didn't go inside when we got there. I stood by the car while they checked the cabin and the surrounding area. They didn't find him, but they did find evidence. Climbing hooks jammed into the side of the cabin, professional grade, hammered deep into the wood near the back corner. Scratches along the siding, boot prints on the roof, dirty ones. The attic hatch had been opened. They said there were signs that someone had been up there recently. Disturbed dust, a blanket shoved in the corner, a plastic bottle half full of water. But no one matching the man I described was ever found. The deputies took my statement and told me it was likely someone living off-grid, maybe squatting, maybe unstable. They said it happens more than people think out there. I didn't go back to that cabin. I grabbed my laptop and bag and drove straight home that same day. I still don't know how long he'd been up there. Maybe just that night, maybe longer. I moved in with my brother for a few months after that. Every noise at night made me flinch. I finished my dissertation from his spare room. I haven't gone back to the woods since, not even to hike. I still dream about that man sometimes. The way he sat there on the roof, motionless, almost patient, like he was waiting,